Okay, so the topic is, are corporations capable of virtue? And let me say the plan, so to speak, that I have in mind is that I'll speak, first of all, a little bit about what I mean by virtue. And of course, the virtue that we all think of that corporations often espouse and claim to display is corporate social responsibility. Then I'm going to talk about uh, corporate bodies in general and ask the question with them, are they capable of virtue? And then I'm going to move on to corporations proper, characterizing them, I hope, in what does not seem like, what will seem like a legally appropriate way from your shared point of view. Okay, so, and of course, with corporations, I'm also going to raise the question of whether they are capable of virtue. And I'm afraid I'm going to raise a sort of skeptical note. In raising this note, I'm very conscious of joining hands or joining voices, so to speak, with the chorus that Joel Bacan, who I think is actually on the panel or attending this podcast as we speak, um, inaugurated with his book on the corporation, where he argued that the corporation could only be characterized as psychopathic in terms of the DSM sort of definition of that particular ailment, that it's structurally, so to speak, insured or unavoidable for a corporation that that sort of psychopathy. I don't actually venture into that language. I stick to rather drier, more arid terms, but I think the line I'm pressing is probably very convergent with the line that he advanced in that book. And I understand continues to advance in a new book, which I haven't yet read, called The New Corporation. Okay, so to start with virtue, I think the first thing really and I have a handout that I think Richard or Josh have sent around, which will give you at least the structure of the points that I'm making and may help with raising questions in the Q&A. So to start with virtue, the first of these three sections in this chat, um, it's very important, I think, to distinguish between acting virtuously and displaying virtue. To displaying virtue in any area of virtue, you have to both have the virtue and act as you act virtuously as a result, so to speak, in expression, in manifestation of having that virtue. So, very simple idea, really. To tell the truth does not mean that you're speaking honestly, because you may be telling the truth because it's opportunistic to tell the truth. It might be that you're not telling the truth robustly, as we say, robustly across situations where it would be less convenient to tell the truth. You're telling the truth because it happens to be in your interest. You're telling the truth opportunistically, as you might put it. Now, if you're telling the truth opportunistically, you may be acting virtuously, so to speak, but you are not displaying the virtue of honesty. I think we all understand that, and which is to say, really, that the effect of giving someone your honesty when you speak honesty to them is an effect that you have and a good that they enjoy at your hands, your honesty, in virtue of the disposition out of which you speak. You speak out of a disposition of virtue, not out of, for example, an opportunistic disposition. So to give someone your honesty, so to speak, is to basically act in a certain way and act out of a corresponding disposition, a disposition we call a virtue. What is that disposition? Well, it's basically the disposition to track the idea that information is being sought and that you're an information giver, and you just take it for granted that because such and such is the truth, that's what you're going to say. You may actually set out to speak the truth for its own sake, so to speak, or it may be that you have other ends, like giving a warning or whatever it might be to the person you're speaking to, but it's a constraint insofar as you are honest. It's a constraint on the pursuit of that end of giving a warning, a constraint that you accept, that you should speak honestly, that in other words, you should act out of a disposition to tell the truth more or less, and we'll come back to the more or less later, more or less regardless of whether it's convenient or not to tell the truth. Okay, so another example, respect. I may treat you respectfully. I may, whatever you might think that involves, say, giving you space to pursue your own ends. I may treat you respectfully, but do so again out of an opportunistic motive, for example. There are other examples I might give of other motives, but I'm going to stick with the opportunistic one, self-interest one. I might treat you respectfully because it suits me to do so. Um, if I do that, I give you respectful treatment, it's true, but I do not give you my respect. In order to give you my respect, I've got to display the virtue of respect, act out of a disposition to, so to speak, treat you in that way, more or less regardless of whether, or less regardless of the temptations, for example, to deal with you otherwise, to intimidate you, to deceive you, for example. I may treat you that way, but not robustly treat you that way. In order to give you respect, I've got to treat you respectfully in a robust fashion. I've got to treat you respectfully out of the virtue of respect, out of the disposition to speak, to treat you respectfully. That is to say, the reason that consists in you are an independent person is enough of a reason for me to treat you respectfully. And I will do that whether or not it suits my interests, even if it might be more of greater interest to me, serve my ends better, my personal ends better, to, for example, intimidate you or treat you deceitfully, coerce you or whatever. I simply eschew that sort of treatment. My treating you respectfully, I do that robustly. And across the variation circumstances where it might actually be in my interest to not treat you respectfully, I'll avoid treating you disrespectfully. I will continue to treat you respectfully. So again, it's like honesty. It's a disposition-dependent good that I give you, and I give it to you insofar as I perform the act associated with it, treating you respectfully, as in telling the truth corresponds to honesty, treating you respectfully, I'm taking as the treatment or the action corresponding to the virtue of respect. And I've got to perform that action robustly, as I'm saying. Third example, I treat you as a friend. Again, I might treat you as a friend out of opportunistic motives, in which case I'm not giving you my friendship. In order to give you my friendship, I've got to treat you as a friend robustly. As I say, I've got to treat you in a way that I would display, I would reproduce, even if it suited me, so to speak, to push you around, to perhaps treat you less than as a friend. For example, let you down in talking to a third person or whatever, that might be very tempting. But if I treat you as a friend, I've got to, if I give you my friendship, I've got to treat you as a friend and avoid that sort of behavior pretty robustly, more or less robustly across temptations not to do so, and so on. Now, I've said more or less with the case of both giving you my honesty, giving you my respect, giving you my friendship. The more or less is for this reason, that while I think in order to behave honestly, or indeed respectfully, or in order to give you honesty or respect, or give you my friendship, while it's certainly true that I have to do this very robustly across all sorts of temptations, there will be occasions, of course, where, as I tend to put it, the red flag goes up. Nice example in the case of friendship, you know, the old joke that says a good friend would help you move an apartment, you know. So, for example, Richard asked me to help him move an apartment. I'm in Edmonton or whatever. And I would certainly say, yes, of course, I'll help you. Let's think about when it would suit both of us, but I will do it. And I would do it even if, you know, oh God, it's such a boring thing to do, etc. I would do it robustly across those sorts of problems or temptations. But if, as the joke goes, Richard were to ask me to move a body, well, that would put on a red light, because it would obviously strike me, as I hope it will strike anyone, that actually in a case like that, he's very likely asking me to be accessory to a crime or to cover up something pretty untoward that's happened that I do not want to be associated with. It suggests that there's a more important value, so to speak, relevant in this particular case. And while I would automatically, in most cases, by default, treat him as a friend in appropriate sort of contexts, if a red flag goes up with something like that, then I will break it. And friendship doesn't require that you should help a friend to move a body if he asks you to do that, or she asks you to do that. And equally, of course, the same is true of respect and honesty. You may be required to tell the truth or to treat another respectfully because of the relevant sort of context, but of course you will retreat from that, so to speak, if a red flag goes up. If it's clear that doing this, speaking truly, or treating someone respectfully, or indeed treating them as a friend, would actually cause a greater ill, then you simply balk, you don't do it. But that doesn't mean you lack the virtue. Of course you have the virtue. I'm just saying that having the virtue doesn't require an absolute commitment to the form of treatment in question. It involves that sort of commitment that is categorical in a way. You don't think about other things, but is not conditional, so to speak, is not immune, is not absolute, I should say, is not absolute over such red flags going up, such red lights going on, as it were. Okay, so with that in mind, I think it's pretty clear that people, most of us, I hope, in most of our lives, we display a lot of virtue, in honesty with our families, with our friends, in affection, in friendship, in love, in giving honesty, in, giving civility, so to speak, treating others in a merely civil way. All of this involves the display of virtue, and I think that comes quite naturally to most people. Unfortunately, of course, we're aware that in some contexts, many people are not virtuous, but I think most people in most contexts well, can I say, our sort of society really are pretty well display that sort of virtue. Now, what I'm going to do is ask whether corporate bodies can be virtuous in that way, or whether corporations in particular can be virtuous in that way. And that question arises in particular with the issue of social responsibility, because after all, when corporations claim to, or when they're encouraged to, be socially responsible, the idea is that they will treat the considerations associated with social responsibility, such as not damaging the environment in a certain way, such as not raising serious problems for the local community, not abusing workers, not abusing consumers in various ways. The idea is presumably that a corporation can have built into it a disposition to treat the consideration relevant to social responsibility as something that robustly constrains how it acts, or robustly is indeed an end in itself for this corporation. That it may, of course, because the consideration is never absolute, it may argue in some cases that it's overridden, as in the case of the friend and the moving of the body. But in general, to be socially responsible, it would have to prioritize this consideration and give it a sort of categorical status, albeit not an absolute status in its decision making. Okay, so that's all I want to say really about virtue. To move on to corporate bodies, now I draw here in good part in this section on a book that Christian List and I published in 2011 called Group Agency. I think it was called The Possibility, the Organization and the Design of Corporate Bodies. Okay, so in that book, for example, what we argue is that, well, rather than repeating what we argue, let me present the line of thought as follows. First of all, let's ask ourselves, what is an agent? I mean, that's a question I think That's very important to ask in this discussion and in many discussions, and is too often taken for granted. And I want to say, and of course it's a bit tendentious, maybe controversial, but I think it's a good starting point. I want to say, first of all, an agent is any sort of system that is organized systematically to pursue a certain end or any of a whole range of ends, where those ends may be pre-given, maybe even hardwired in, or there may be ends that it itself can change and alter under certain procedures. Okay, so on that characterization, for example, a sunflower won't be an agent, even though a sunflower does have an end, a goal. I mean, at least in certain contexts, which is to move so as to maximize its exposure to sunlight in the course of the day. So that's an end that the sunflower is pursuing. But it's not pursuing it, well, I use the word systematically. Maybe I should explain a bit. What I mean by that is that it's pursuing that in a very specific type of situation. Um, it's not pursuing that end across various situations. It's not organized so that did the situation vary in all sorts of ways, it would still pursue that end. And I think a system is an agent only if it does that, if it pursues one or more ends across a certain range of situations, not just in a particular situation or a particular type of situation. So Kristen and I in that book actually give a very simple example of a little robot. Um, there's a little artifice, a piece of equipment, say, I put on the table. We're all sitting around a table, flat table. There's some bottles and glasses on the table. Some of them are lying on their sides, some of them are standing up. And I put this object in the center of the table, and we all look at it. It's got wheels, and it's got little levers at the side, and it's got stalks at the top, so to speak, at the head of this little object. We notice that maybe I've got to press a button as it were to start, that it goes to the center and it scans, as we might put it with these stalks. It moves in situ so as to, as it were, see the glasses and bottles around. And we notice that it fixates on any bottle or glass that is lying on its side. And then the wheels move and it moves towards this bottle or glass. And then the levers move and they lift up the bottle or glass into upright position. And having done that, the little object retreats to the center and goes through the scanning motions again and will once again fixate on anything on its side and go through those motions of lifting it. Now, I think, and this of course is a very simple agent, but it is an agent in the sense I've described. It's got an end. It's only got one end, we might say, to put objects upright that are lying on their side. It pursues this end, as the sunflower pursues the end of following the sun, but it does so over intuitively quite different situations, because after all, the glass or the bottle may be a glass or a bottle. That's a variation already, and regardless of which it is, it'll still go and try to lift it up. Equally, the glass or bottles that it tries to lift up, some of them are they vary in the distance from the actual little object, and they also vary in the direction from the object. But robustly, so to speak, over variations in the nature of the object lying on its side, the distance from the robot, and the direction which it lies. The robot is organized so as still to pursue the end in that situation of putting the objects it scans, as we might say, it sees, if we can think of the stalks as registering things so as to see them, so as to lift them. So it is clearly an agent. Now, no agent is perfect, of course. And even though we know now, let's suppose we conclude that it has been designed to do precisely the end, the goal, perform the goal that we've assigned to it, we're not going to be very upset if we find that when a bottle or object is very near the edge, when it tries to lift it, the object, the bottle or glass, falls off the table. We'll probably put that down to, well, circumstances were not normal, so to speak. We're not intuitively normal. It's designed for circumstances where the object to be picked up is at a certain is not is at a certain distance from the edge of the table. And of course, if the lights go out, it's not able to perform either. It's only performs as an agent in certain circumstances. Now, of course, animals are all agents, the animals we know, and of course, we are agents. Though, of course, animals and we differ enormously in having much greater range of goals and in having a much greater capacity for forming representations. Now, I've introduced a new notion with the idea of representation, but go back to the robot. If the robot is robustly going to pursue its end across different scenarios, that it has to change within itself in a way that co-varies with the nature of the scenario it's in. So, for example, if it's a bottle, the levers have to take a certain shape in lifting it, grasp, so to speak. If it's at a certain distance, it goes the distance required, a certain direction, it goes the direction required, and so on. And we might say that by saying it's got to, the change it undergoes on seeing that, oh, it's a bottle at that distance and in that direction. That's a representation within the agency, the little robot, of the situation in which it is. And that representation guides its pursuit of the goal of raising objects to the upright position. Now, obviously, animals and we humans vary not just in the range of goals we have, but also in the range of representations we're capable of forming. And we human beings are very special because of language and the capacity to share representations with one another, to stand back and examine representations. I'm not going to talk about the complexity of that, but I want to use that notion of agency to ask the question of what would it be for a group of people to constitute an agent. And I'm going to call a group that constitutes an agent a corporate agent. And the problem there is you've got, say, 20 people in a room, and we want to act as a body, as a corporate agent. Well, problem is we each got different goals and we each got different representations of the world around us. Um, we've got to agree in order to act as a body, we've got to agree on a goal or maybe a set of goals to act together on, each of us playing our part in a common action for that end. But we've equally got to agree on the representations that will guide the lines, the motions, excuse me, the behaviors that we each perform in playing our part. We've got to agree on that about what we should do. Now, how would we do that? Well, Thomas Hobbes really had the simplest idea possible, though he was drawing on medieval ideas, of how you might form such an agent. He said, we in a group could form such an agent by nominating someone to be our leader, so to speak, to be our spokesperson, someone who will tell us, okay, guys, this is the goal we have, or these are the goals we have, and then will tell us how we've got to behave in order to achieve that goal in a given scenario. And as the scenario differs, will tell us the different things we've got to do. And of course, in telling us what we ought to do, that, so to speak, dictator, that leader, will tell some people to do this and other people to do that. The voice, so to speak, of that leader we all rally behind that voice and we let it lead us as we might let our own decisions lead us in acting for ourselves. In acting for the group, we authorize that voice, setting aside our own goals, our own judgments, insofar as we're prepared to act for the group. That was Hobbes' idea of, well, he talked about a company of merchants, that they would act just like that in pursuing a common goal, that each agree to a certain pattern. Maybe they establish someone that they will follow who will dictate exactly, say, where they go if they're going on a trading expedition, think 17th century now, and exactly how to pursue that goal of getting there, what route to take, and so on. And we all fall in line. We are members of that company of merchants. Of course, he also thought that the state is a corporate agent of just that kind, and that there has to be a sovereign voice. And the sovereign voice is the voice around which we all rally in the state as the state pursues the end of laying down the law and establishing a common order that we as subjects of that sovereign actually are supposed to implement or honor in our actions. Hobbes himself recognized that, of course, apart from that personal voice, that we might rally behind, you could have a procedurally authorized voice, a procedure that would give a voice for every issue about what we ought to do or what we ought to think, what representations we ought to follow. And he says that the procedure to follow would be majority voting. Now, as I've argued at length, as well, I'm Christian, I actually proved a little mathematical theorem around this. And majority voting just won't work for all sorts of reasons. It generates an inconsistent voice to follow on a range of issues. I'll not go into that any further. But there are procedures, apart from majority voting, although Hobbes himself didn't think this, that will, of course, generate a voice around which we might rally. So, for example, we might decide that, well, this group of people in this group, this subgroup of people, will decide on what ends to pursue, say my majority voting, and this other group of people, or maybe just one other person, will decide, will look for inconsistencies of any kind, and will just simply eliminate, make for consistency in the set of judgments or the set of goals pursued. And the voice that we follow is a voice that emerges from the interaction between those two sub bodies. And that sort of procedure will again generate a voice that a corporate body might follow. Okay, corporate bodies I'm thinking of, not corporations. Something like, for example, I think I give examples at the top of page 2 of the handout. A condominium, a club, an association, an NGO may organize themselves broadly in this way, having a procedurally generated voice, say condominium. We elect a committee. I live in a condominium in Canberra. We elect a committee that makes various decisions, but publicizes these decisions, and they can be challenged by any individual. And if enough individuals challenged, there's a meeting of all of the residents and so on. Or it may be that we devolve certain decision making to an attorney that we hire or a financial advisor that we hire or whatever it might be. But we manage to make decisions pretty systematically as a group, as the group of residents in the condominium, and similarly goes for a club and an NGO, whatever it might be. We might be more or less dictatorial. We might have a single personal voice that we authorize, but that's unlikely. We usually go for a procedurally generated voice, but it's still the same structure of authorizing a voice to emerge and then each of us rallying behind it and doing basically acting according to the voice's representation of how things are and acting according to its specifications or under constraints it lays down about what we should each do in pursuing that end. Now, can a corporate body of that kind be virtuous? Well, I would say certainly it can. So, for example, an NGO can commit to pursuing a certain end, treating a certain consideration in the relevant area as categorical for it, as something that will constrain how it behaves, and that will maybe act as an end in particular contexts as well. And we, as a body, recognize what we're committed to and signing up to the body, becoming members, and we will rally behind. And if those who are generating the voice or enacting the voice fail to be sufficiently responsive to that consideration, say, for example, the condominium, in the condominium case, the executive committee we've established to promote to make and publicize the decisions it wants to make, if it begins to do crazy things. I once belonged to a condominium where the members of the executive committee decided Asian bird flu was the great threat coming in the next 10 years and spent a lot of money buying fridges in order to keep the vaccines that they were sure. Well, there was an immediate reaction, and of course the body self-corrects. And so you can think a body like that is virtuous in it will robustly authorize various considerations and remain faithful to them. It can be socially responsible, for example, in the relevant sense of social responsibility for the body in question. Okay, now, so we see more or less what virtue is and how individuals can often be virtuous and display virtue. And I think it's pretty clear that corporate bodies of the kind I've characterized can display virtue too, by virtue and by dint of the commitments of various members and by the fact that they will keep an eye, each of them, on what's happening, and each of them, as it were, blow a whistle if the corporate body is not actually remaining faithful to the virtue it claims to display. Okay, so on to corporations now. Well, here I feel there's an old Irish expression which Richard may remember, uh, which was the expression, "You're teaching your grandmother to suck eggs." It's a very rural agricultural metaphor, but I hope it's intelligible. I've never sucked an egg, I must say, but apparently it must have been a habit in which the older folk were well versed, and uh, grandchildren did not have to teach their grandmothers how to suck an egg. The grandmother would certainly have known and probably known better how to do that. Well, I feel a bit the same in telling all of you who are all of you legally trained and constitutionally aware and so on, going through the following lines. So let me do it quite briefly. So a corporation, I guess we can all agree, is a corporate body of the kind that we've just described. That's a very generic kind, but it's one that's organized specifically to pursue a commercial goal. Let's say it's because we're focusing on for-profit corporations. And thirdly, actually, I should really qualify that last remark, but let me not delay over it. And thirdly, most importantly, the corporation has a very specific mode of organization. It's not just any old corporate body. And I think I find, and many of you recognize the work I'm drawing upon, mainly the work of lawyers and legal historians who often concentrate in different countries. And I've had to try to draw together a bit of a simplified version of what I think happened. What happened is the history of the subject, as I've read it in a simple version of it, is this. In Holland, in particular, the United Provinces, as they're called, the Netherlands, and in Britain, in England, of the late 16th and early 17th century, there were a lot of companies of merchants, in Hobbes's phrase, and particular trading companies going to the East Indies and so on to pick up spices and bringing them back and being a trading center for basically the rest of Europe, for example. And it became clear, I think, about this time that there were three problems that such a corporate body, under the existing mode of organization, created. Let's call such a corporate body, as it was called often in the time and is called in the literature, a partnership. Now, I know partnerships nowadays are sometimes more like corporations, I'm going to characterize them, but partnership in this older sense had three problems. One was a problem that any partner was entitled to withdraw from the enterprise if they wanted to liquidate, for example, what they had invested in the enterprise, and thereby putting the whole enterprise, making it vulnerable. So everyone's going to be worried about other partners that they may withdraw their assets and thereby cause the whole corporate body to flounder in the goal it had espoused. Big danger. Second danger, under the law, at least in many places, I understand it, if a corporate body, if an individual partner in the partnership failed, then the creditors of that partner, of that individual, could actually sue not just the partner and their private holdings, but the partnership itself, the corporate body, for redress of its complaint. Okay, so that exposed the entity, so to speak, in question, the corporate body, again to that danger. And thirdly, there was a danger which we're all familiar with, which is that under the existing laws, if the body failed, then the creditors of that bankrupt body could pursue not just the reserves, the assets of that corporate body, but the private assets of individual investors in the body for they could pursue it for redress of their complaint. So those are three major problems. And really, the corporation emerges by way of solutions to those three problems. Now, the full corporation really only begins to mature in the 19th century. Of course, there was the big hole associated with the South Sea Company and the South Sea bubble. I'm not going to go into that in detail. But the solution, as I sort of read the history, involved three responses to these three vulnerabilities. In response to the problem that a partner could withdraw at will, leaving the others in the lurch, asset lock-in was introduced, whereby you couldn't withdraw your assets once you had invested them. I mean, that seems like a really very, very powerful constraint. You'd wonder, why would anyone go in for it? But of course, almost at the same time, not I think quite at the same time, interestingly, but almost at the same time as that became legally possible to lock in your assets, there emerged a share market, initially in coffee houses in Amsterdam and London, whereby people who did want to liquidate their assets and couldn't withdraw the assets, so to speak, in that sense, couldn't withdraw their money, could actually sell the share of the profits to which they were entitled, the dividends to which they're entitled, to other people. And so that made it possible for asset lock-in, I think, to become a very viable sort of measure. A second element was, I call it here entity shielding. Actually, that's a word some people recognize is in the legal literature. And entity shielding meant that laws were introduced and norms grew up, whereby you couldn't pursue the entity for the debts of an individual investor. And the third, of course, was investor shielding, which we know as limited liability, investor shielding, which meant that you couldn't pursue the entity if you were in seeking redress for the debts of a private investor in their own right. And so asset lock-in, entity shielding, and investor shielding create a very different sort of enterprise. That enterprise was mainly, the way it was set up was that the government of the day in England, whether by an act of parliament or royal decree, would establish the corporation and would establish the corporation with a particular end in mind. For example, a trading corporation, it was as in for example, the East India Company, and there was a corresponding company in Holland was very important. Or indeed, later in the 17th century, the Bank of England was established as by an act of parliament in that way, even though it was initially a private enterprise. And such an entity was then protected under, well, certainly asset lock-in and entity shielding, and in effect, I think with investor shielding as well. Some people have argued that, even though limited liability only became really recognized very formally in law, probably in the 19th century. Also, of course, with these acts setting up a corporation, a government of the corporation was established with the usual shareholders, annual meeting for shareholders, directors, a board of directors who are answerable to the AGM, and then, of course, a management team who are appointed strictly by the board, and so on and then, of course, employees who are employed by this enterprise, as well as contractors with whom the enterprise is entitled to form contracts of various kinds. Okay, so that's all hunky-dory, and it does solve the problems, so to speak, of the partnership. But you get, I think, three developments that are very important that occur between after the 17th century for sure, some of them in the 18th century, and some of them in the 19th century. And the big change, really, the first big change was that corporations are entitled to form privately by going to a notary or to a lawyer, as we would say, and just forming. You didn't have to go to the parliament or to the king. I mean, that was an immense sort of change. A second change was that a corporation formed privately in that way was equally entitled to change its domain of operation. So the trading company could become a bank, for example, or could become a textile manufacturing company. And the corporation wasn't tied to operating in any specific domain. A third change that was really important, I think, was that corporations were allowed to invest in other corporations, to become the majority shareholder in another corporation, perhaps the only shareholder in another corporation, and of course to create another corporation in which it is the only shareholder. And in doing this, would enjoy investor shielding so that the company it controls, and it might control it completely, um, can be found in debt or indeed found in breach of tort law without the corporation that established it being exposed. It would have the same investor shielding as a private shareholder. Now, with those three developments, I think you get a cascade of effects. Um, One effect is, of course, that if you go back to now, what are the motives? Are they for shareholders to sign up to buy shares in a given corporation? Well, previously, that motive might be connected to the importance they gave to the domain in which the corporation was acting, say in building canals or building railways. Um, it might, in that sense, be tied to an interest in that domain or a traditional sort of family commitment in that domain or whatever it might be. But once, of course, corporations can operate in any old domain, that motive is going to be at least weakened very strongly, because you can't be sure the corporation will remain in that domain. It may move from railways to road building and so on. Okay, so that's one shift, a shift in the motives of shareholders. Then you ask, well, what are the motives of shareholders going to be as they move money around or decide where to invest their money? Well, it's presumably going to more and more have to depend on the size of the dividend, because after all, if they're now no longer connected to the domain of operation, there isn't any single fixed domain of operation. They obviously have to focus on is what are the dividends like, or what is the prospective value, of course, of the shares like, what are they of the company and the shares in the company. And this, of course, is exacerbated by the growth of the financial industry and the internationalization of the financial industry, because finance houses of various kinds are themselves going to attract their members, for example, pensioners, pension funds going to attract employers to join up with us on the grounds that we actually are investing our money in such a way that we're getting maximum returns for those who want to put their superannuation with us, for example, rather than with some rival body. And so, as this massive sort of shift to a financial sort of industry as well, it means that it really is going to be the case more and more that shares in these companies are dictated by a concern with the, well, let's call it the shareholder value at this point. And of course, once that happens, board and management are going to clearly now be themselves committed to maximizing shareholder value, because they're going to realize the AGM is going to blow the whistle very loudly on them if they're not delivering in terms of the returns in dividends. So you get an absolute focus on the shareholder value on the part of those who are running the corporation. This, in turn, this effect is exacerbated, it seems to me, by the fact that uh, top managers, are so often rewarded nowadays in terms of being given shares. So they've got a personal interest in increasing the shares. The second feature, I think, is that managers within any enterprise tend to win in-house esteem for the cleverness of the schemes they come up with in order to maximize the benefit of the corporation. That's where, they're going to most loudly be praised, as it were. That's where they're going to look for their prospects of promotion. most fervently. But another one is that even if they are doing things which maybe they wouldn't do in their own name, they'd feel embarrassed about it. I mean, this might be evicting a tenant, if you're a landlord sort of type agency. Um, they're going to feel, well, look, I'm just acting for my principal, it's not me. I have a duty of responsibility to my principal, in this case, the corporation. I think all of these effects make it, so to speak, that shareholder value becomes the absolute sort of concentrated focus in how the corporation organizes. Now, I think that as a result of these problems, go back to our question, can corporations display a virtue like social responsibility? Well, I think they're going to find it close to impossible, because in order to display a virtue of social responsibility, you're going to have to take one or another considerations of the kind I mentioned, the welfare of the community, the welfare of the environment, and so on. You're going to have to take it and have to prioritize it, robustly treat it as a constraint in how you act. Well, now, how are managers, top managers, going to be capable of displaying that responsiveness as such a consideration if they realize in any situation, in any case where such responsiveness is going to actually jeopardize the shareholder value and is going to ultimately actually not be good for their career and may mean that the AGM are going to see that they're fired or whatever it might be. So that the corporation as a whole, I think, gets locked in so that the agencies within the corporation, so to speak, the voice that is generated and authorized and rallied behind, is constrained in such a way that while it may purport to be socially responsible, identifying some let's say, social consideration as a priority for it, that it will treat as categorically binding in the fashion of a virtuous corporation, it's actually just not going to be able to do that, because the parts that would have to move will not move in that way, given the motives that they are operating under. Now, I should say I've been focused entirely on what I call regular corporations, because there are benefit corporations, and a benefit corporation is quite different, because the benefit corporation announces in advance a constraint or an end it's going to have, and therefore shareholders that join up or buy shares know what they're buying into. And so the AGM is, if they change their minds, others at the AGM are going to shut them down. They're going to stick with the benefit corporation. But most corporations are not benefit corporations, and it's those other corporations, regular corporations, that I think they're group agents, all right, and they fit to be held responsible, as any agent of a kind like them is fit to be held responsible. They're fit to be held responsible to the law. So I would say it makes perfect sense to hold a corporation even criminally responsible, and I've argued that elsewhere, and certainly responsible in other aspects of the law too, which is indeed what we do in most jurisdictions. They can fit to be held responsible, but you can't hold them responsible for not being virtuous, because literally they don't have the capacity. As with an individual, a child isn't able to do certain things, so we don't blame it if it doesn't do those things. Um, we would with an adult, or an adult who's capable of doing them. We will blame them for not doing them, certain good things. But an adult who is in some way impaired, we may not blame them. Well, I think corporations are, in that sense, impaired corporate agents that we just simply can't hold responsible, and they can't robustly espouse the end of being socially responsible. I think as a result, we've got to rely on the law and the state in order to keep corporations, so to speak, in check, in order to keep them on track in areas where we think social responsibility is really important. And that really brings me to the end. You may have all sorts of ideas about how the law might do that, and I think it's important to recognize there are various ways in which the law and the state might do that. But I'll stop at that point and stop at this very, I'm afraid, pessimistic conclusion. I fear, as indeed many have argued, and in particular Joel Bakan, have argued that the corporation is incapable of social responsibility in the sense which that's understood, incapable more generally of displaying virtue.